We good to go. It's around here. Excellent. The Joy of Love. Good morning. Welcome to Radio Maria Ireland. Great to have your company here. Thanks indeed for joining us. Shout out to everybody there on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. And we go live a little bit early, so you see me getting myself ready and organised here on the camera without much in the way of conversation. So sorry about that. But indeed, welcome to one and all. As always, please do get in touch. 014 123456. Mary will answer the phone there if you want to ring it straight away. You might have a prayer intention and maybe a music request. They're a bit difficult for us to get in with the flow of conversation that tends to go on here. But also, indeed, you might have some little feedback, or likewise in the same way, you might have a thought or a question you might like to pose. This is Chatechesis, so opportunity to speak about our faith and converse and share it too. +353 14123456 if you're outside of Ireland or in the north of Ireland. Do please give us a call. Now 089 467 2000 as well to text and WhatsApp us here. info@radiomaria.ie is our email. And you can like, share, follow and subscribe right here on Facebook and YouTube and send in your message and comments. Again, even if you're listening back later or if this is a repeat show or a podcast, you're more than welcome to get in touch with us here. We do like to continue the conversation and direct it according to your needs there as well. Thanks to Frank who was in touch there. And I did get the image you sent, Frank, but I wasn't able to open it. It was in relation to a religious experience Frank said he had at Knock. And isn't it interesting, we from time to time have what we might call these transfiguring moments or insights where we're touched by grace or divine grace comes to allow us a little moment of reprieve, as it were, as if the veil is lifted and we can see or we perceive or we can sense that our faith is true, that this is Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. The Father reveals this to us, as Jesus says to Peter when he declared Jesus as the Christ. It is not you, who discern this or discover this. It is my Father has revealed this to you. So no doubt, Frank, you've had that lovely moment indeed, as we all do, and I hope indeed you've had one or two such moments. These are perhaps not things we should go clamoring after or pursuing after, running after. That can be a risky proposition too. If I want to hear and find out what the next alleged message is, the next locution, the next vision, the next mystical experience. One of the dangers there is if we pursue these things, they can become, first of all, an end in itself. That's one. There are other dangers too. That we end up feeding from these things and we need the next spiritual high or the next emotional high that accompanies occasionally such things, which can in its own way be kind of like not so much an addiction perhaps, but the way we sometimes seek the pleasures of life. We wish our lives away, waiting for the day off, waiting for the weekend, waiting for the summer holidays, waiting for retirement. And before we know, life is over. So that's a foolish proposition to be pursuing these things because, again, this is not the end in itself. Who we seek ultimately is, and what we seek, I suppose, is a relationship with Jesus Christ. He is our Lord and God. He is the way, the truth, and the life. and no one can come to the Father except through him. So if it is that we get a little sidelined or sidetracked by messages or apparitions or mystical experiences or highs like that, we need to just be a little bit careful that we don't get sidelined altogether from the task at hand. The other danger is also that we could so easily be deceived. And that's been known to happen even to the greatest and most famous of mystics. They can be deceived by evil spirits who represent themselves, as Scripture and St. Paul reminds, as angels of light, but in order to deceive, in order to misguide, in order to lead astray. And just like I've used this analogy before, rat poison is so tasty and so yummy and so lovely to the rat who we're trying to poison and get rid of. It contains just a tiny amount of strychnine or arsenic, whatever the toxic chemical is, and kills the rat. Or warfarin, I think, is one of the ones they use in rat poison, which in wrong doses is highly dangerous. The same can be true of the spiritual life, that we can be so easily misled and deceived. So it's always good to hold fast to Christ and his church and his teaching. We see this a similar kind of thing at a different angle or extreme, or what's the right, again I never quite get the right words to express what I'm referring to, but that those who would see the church as wrong or out of line or misguided or misdirected and would seek their own path. So there are those who would say that Pope Francis isn't a real pope, that we haven't had a real pope since the Second Vatican Council. For example, that's one of many different kinds of groups. That's another dangerous path. You see, there's a lot of little tricky byroads and side roads which seem to be good and seem to be, because I've read and I've heard the arguments put forward by those who would speak of a sede vacante, is that the right Latin? The empty seat, that the See of Rome it hasn't been validly filled since the Second Vatican Council. Or, variations of a theme of that kind, that Pope Francis isn't an authentic pope, or so on and so forth. Well, when we start down that path, more questions have to be asked. And the danger there, again, is that we can so easily deceive ourselves. We can become embroiled in a kind of echo chamber mentality where we're hearing and only tuning in to those who believe the same as we do, and we're not seeing the wood for the trees, and we're questioning everything and finding fault with everything, and not docile to the voice of the Spirit, to the voice of the Church. So you can see it's a tricky path to walk on. And Father Owen was chatting about it this morning. We've had a couple of others speaking about it, and Frank too brought it up there in the email you sent in. Thank you, Frank, about the traditional form of the Mass. And just to mention that I've been speaking with Thomas Murphy. He's very much involved in the Catholic Heritage Association. Wonderful group, and they've been on the radio here before my time, and friends of Radio Maria long since. And they share with us wonderful stories and history and devotion of times past, which are still valid today. So the sodality of Our Lady, is not so prevalent today, let's say, but certainly a very worthy organization founded by the Jesuits and has a long-standing tradition. Children of Mary, I think, was another name for members of the sodality. And the idea to foster devotion to Our Lady. Now, these things, may have waned in terms of practice or devotion nowadays, but are wonderful means to nurture people's lives of faith, ongoing formation. And so the Catholic Heritage Association sought to bring us Mass in the traditional form every other Friday, and we have two wonderful priests coming in to share that with us. But Pope Francis has, as it were, restored the authority in the celebration of the traditional form to the local bishop, rather than having it based through Rome. And Pope Benedict and Pope St. John Paul II kind of took hold of that liturgical authority with a view to do a couple of very good things to seek to hold fast to those who are heading off on a path of separation from the church on account of this fidelity to the old rite of the Mass, and then setting themselves up almost in opposition to the church. That was not a good direction to be going in. And then those who would simply rally against the church altogether and say, look, again, that idea of a sede vacantinist approach, all the popes were invalid. So they sought to try to bring and wean back in those who are adhering to the traditional form and the Latin liturgy, which is indeed very beautiful and very worthy and very uplifting part of our journey in faith together. But those who seek to, as it were, weaponize it or use it as a kind of a breakaway, not a healthy thing. And Pope Francis has been observing that and seeing that taking place, and no doubt he's heard from many bishops around the world to say, look, we have various groups here who are creating friction and tension and drawing the faithful away from the church. And that cannot be a healthy thing either if it leads to disunity, no matter how right a person thinks they are. You put it in the context of the family. A son or a daughter, a parent, they can be convinced they're right and their way is the only way, and yet somehow alienate the rest of the family. How is that a good thing? Dialogue helps, mutual understanding helps a great deal, and then uniformity of practice and belief. So Pope Francis trying to, not to enforce, but rather to, again, redelegate that authority to local bishops, so that all will be done according to growth in unity rather than disunity. So, please God, Thomas Murphy and the Catholic Heritage Association with us will work it out. We'll get the right permissions necessary from the Archbishop in order to bring you the Mass in the traditional form here on Rite. Continue to do so. Again, if it's permitted with the correct obedience, always so important. Otherwise, how can grace flow when there's disobedience? That only came out last Friday, so it'll take a little time for the dust to settle on these things and for the right protocols and so on to be put in place. But it's certainly our desire not to lose sight of the traditional form and to continue to make it available to you. Just as on a Friday we like to celebrate Holy Mass as Gaeilge and not lose sight of our tradition and heritage in the Irish language. On the other hand too, and this is maybe worth referencing as well, and we're kind of strong on this topic on Radio Maria too, is that, and Pope Francis indeed emphasized that for us as well, that on the one hand it's not a case of suppressing the old rite, it's a case of guiding it such that it doesn't lead on a path of division. On the other hand too, it's also a case of seeking to celebrate the Novus Ordo, that is the new order, the new rite of the Holy Mass, with the greatest of dignity and reverence and prayerfulness that is intended for it. If you read the Vatican documents, you'll see all that's very much built in to how the new rite of the Holy Mass should be celebrated. And avoiding again some of the other extremes that have entered in, or some of the wayward liturgical practices, liturgical abuses that have been allowed to sweep in, and to try to rediscover and recover a sense of reverence. So it could easily be argued that we've lost reverence in so many different ways, especially towards the Holy Eucharist, through changing the geography and the layout of the sanctuary and the churches, changing the way we receive Holy Communion, and sort of making, I don't know what is sort of lowering it, or lowering the standard, or again losing a sense of authentic reverence. But just one point on that, which I've mentioned here before, and would certainly encourage all of you as our dear listeners of Radio Maria, that in the general instruction on the Roman Missal for Holy Mass, for receiving Holy Communion, we're asked always to make a sign of reverence before we receive Holy Communion, if it is that we're not receiving kneeling. Now, it's not compulsory one way or the other. It's because it's discretionary, because not everybody's able to kneel to receive Holy Communion. And we had altar rails, of course, in times gone by that everybody would religiously kneel at, but I'm sure there were some in those days who aren't able to kneel either. And it's nice to see churches that have retained that custom and where it is available as a possibility. I've worked in parishes, and it's lovely to see. We have a little section of altar rail where people who wanted to come and kneel to receive would come and kneel and receive. I think for the time being, the prescription is there still that the preference is to receive on the hand for the sake of the transmission of the virus and caution in relation to the transmission of the virus. But again, perhaps that prescript will be redirected again, that people can receive on the tongue. Again, it's a nice reverent way. But here's what we certainly can do, is that an act of reverence before receiving the Lord. And I've seen it done very beautifully in some parishes where everyone is very careful to make a bow from the waist before receiving the Lord. And then with great caution and great care, great reverence, extending the palm of the hand, supported by the other palm, but again flat and with due caution and discretion, and always checking the hand after placing Holy Communion on the tongue to make sure there's no particles or fragments remaining. So to really take our time coming to the Lord. So there may be time as you're lining up, things are a little different now in parishes. Sometimes the priest is coming down to the pews. Maybe in the pew there's an opportunity to receive kneeling, if that's the case. But if we're coming up in line, surely now that there's limited numbers and there isn't the same crowds coming to Mass to extend communion over a long period of time, that we can make that due act of reverence. I would suggest hands joined. You know, First Communion, boys and girls come up with their hands prayerfully joined. I think that's a very simple custom, but it's a lovely sign of reverence as we approach Jesus in Holy Communion. A genuflection then, again, if it's possible. Kneeling, if that's available too. But certainly a bow from the waist as the person ahead of us is receiving Holy Communion. So I think the fact that we have certain restrictions now, and the fact that there are limited on numbers, it should lend itself to even that small change, small little tweak on our part to approach the Holy Eucharist with the greatest of reverence in a Holy Mass, and playing our part, you know, as the people of God, to be able to bring back a little bit more of that decorum and sense of wonder and awe in God's presence that we practice and worship in the Holy Mass. And to me, I find it very hard to blame, or I can understand very easily those who would have a preference towards the traditional form of the Mass, because the reverence that's practiced there is plainly evident, and the silences, the prayerfulness of the people, and generally people who would be fond of the traditional form would be very devout and very faith-filled likewise. I'm told now, because I'm not old enough to remember when the traditional form was the form of the Mass, that things weren't all that different as we see in the liturgy in some respects today. There were priests who were a bit more casual. You had congregations attending who again were a mixed selection of those who were very devout and those who were attending because they were attending. And you know, there's some similar characteristics that we see, people arriving late, going early, all those things were just as prevalent. You know, just because the Mass is in the traditional form doesn't mean everything was going swimmingly well and with extreme devotion and care back in those days either. I don't think so. I doubt it, in fact, given human nature. But what we can do for our part, one at a time and one soul at a time most certainly, is to change a little. One of my little exhortations always in big parishes was to move forward about 10 pews. You know, make a change. There's a tendency in Ireland, and I hope it's different now because of the way that we have to seat ourselves around the place, is that people congregate towards the back of the church. So I'd always try to move forward, change your perspective, change your and the exterior. Now I know it seems a little silly, but those small things, those little things like joining hands, that act of reverence, moving forward a little in the church, they're only very small. For some, it can be quite challenging to begin that little change. But these are the ways that we can exteriorly discipline ourselves in order to interiorly enhance our devotion and our love for Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. So that really is what's at stake in all this conversation in relation to the Pope's recent motu proprio and those good and loyal and wonderful people who have such great devotion to the Mass in the traditional form. But what's certainly needed, it's a kind of a both and, I would say. And I do hope maybe the Holy Father might issue a further instruction or a further word on the reverent celebration of the Holy Mass. We've certainly had the newer translation into English from the Latin of 2014, and the words there so very different from the previous text in relation to the Eucharistic prayers and the collects as well. And just a way of saying, look, this is not just an ordinary sort of celebration that we're on, or this can't be expressed in language that's too familiar. That there's a way of showing our worship and praise of God that's in keeping with our tradition. That's what the new translation of the Missal sought to do, and to formalize and make it very clear which parts are for the priest and which parts are for the laity, when we stand and sit and kneel, and how all these movements are integral into a uniformity of the celebration of the sacred mysteries, and again the priest to cultivate devotion. One of the difficulties I find, certainly many priests will find, is the inherent, I suppose, sense of when the priest is facing the people of having to perform or even entertain, God forbid, but to somehow be to lead and preside over the Holy Eucharist. Now that demands, obviously, you're, as a priest, you're at the microphone, you're in control of the proceedings. So for the priest himself then, how to balance that idea of celebrating something so sacred and so awesome and so much in need of decorum and reverence, and not to allow himself to be tempted to bring his own personality to bear on what he's doing. That's a difficult one, again, when you're facing people, and when we live in a culture of entertainment like this. I'm looking at a camera now, I'm talking into a microphone now. It's hard to avoid the sort of sense of having to entertain, having to raise the pitch, having to animate things and maybe bring in a little bit of personality into it. Not a good practice in the Holy Mass. The priest should be subsumed maybe into the personality of Christ rather. A difficult enough thing to do and to achieve, because it's hard for the priest not to be himself and not to bring his own idiosyncrasies and so on into the prayer of the Mass. So that'll be one of the arguments that, again, how to figure that one out and figure a way through that. But again, in the facing of the people and the prayers in the vernacular, meaning the local language, it means it's so very much accessible to those who are listening and attending, and the prayerful full participation of the congregation. It can be encouraged when the priest is facing the people to get everyone to sing aloud, have those parts of the Mass which are given over to singing properly, proper to be sung, and allow people to participate as fully as possible in that action of the Mass, singing primarily, certainly praying all those parts, and again the gestures and so forth. So it's a conversation that can be extended upon, and lots more to be said, and perhaps I should begin to dedicate a period of time to just going through the general instruction on the Roman Missal and sharing with you. If you're listening on a Friday at 10:06, Tara is sharing the musical dimension of that. We've already discussed from cover to cover, actually, on the Vatican documents here, musicam sacram and the role of sacred music in the liturgy. So it's an ongoing formation, really, and an ongoing development in our understanding of the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the greatest thing on earth. There is nothing greater. There's nothing else in the world it should matter. And why it's so lovely to be able to share with you here Holy Mass every day, twice a day, sometimes, of course, 3 times on a Sunday. So such are some sort of thoughts in and around that controversy that the secular media have made of it. Of course they would. on the Holy Father's instruction in relation to the right ordered celebration of the traditional form. So as I say here on Radio Maria, we do hope, please God, to continue with that practice as we've been sharing with you every other Friday. And we will do so, of course, with permission. We'll seek the correct confirmation that we are permitted with to go ahead with this as well. So now, very good. That's an interesting message. I thought there were issues with the traditional form of Mass relating to references to the Jewish people. That I'm not sure of. I'd have to research that a little bit more. I didn't think that was the case. So my understanding from the Vatican website and Vatican News was that it was just in relation to safeguarding the practice so that it doesn't become a source of division. That was my understanding. I'd have to look that up a little further. So thanks, Christine, for your shout out there on Facebook. Paul as well says balance is the key to success. Well, again, it's trying to find the right pathway. Balance is a good word too. Find the right pathway through all of these things so that everyone can, not a kind of syncretism or a bit of every flavor, but rather a pathway of truth, really, that all can safely follow. And Vincent's watching in as well on Facebook too. Thanks for that, Vincent. A little piece of music now. Josh Groban is more a secular, what do you describe him? Kind of Frank Sinatra, crooner, I suppose that they call these kind of guys. But interesting performer. And I like the little bits of Josh Groban. He's a lovely voice, where he invites people in the audience to come up and sing. And of course they blow him away with their terrific voices. I like that in a performer. It just shows that they're not too motivated by self-aggrandizement, and they're willing to let other talent share, So you have those lovely moments on YouTube from time to time. But fair play, these great performers sing the classics for us and bring an interesting nuance to it. It'll be interesting if you listen to this Ave Maria by Josh Groban now. Does it come across that he's singing it from a sense of faith, would you say? Or does it sound like he's performing it? I don't think I've heard this before now, but I'll just keep a little ear out on that. See what you think. Do you think it's he's singing it out of, a faithful devotional love of Our Lady, or not? I don't know. I don't want to cast any aspersions on Josh Groban, because again he's a beautiful singer. But see what you think. It's just interesting to see. I'll be on a little theory on that as well too, I suppose. Again, 089 467 2000. Excuse me. If you want to text and WhatsApp, give us a call on 014 123 456. Email info@radiomaria.ie. Drop a comment and a like here on our social media too. We'd love to hear from you. Now, Ave Maria. Thanks, Tara. I'll turn it on for you here as well. Second. Here we are. Yeah, thanks. Oh, Josh Groban there. It'll continue on for another little bit there. We'll just step into it. So now, a lovely performance, I would say, of the Ave Maria, definitely. I suppose hard to know, really. I wouldn't like to, I don't know if he's a man of faith. Perhaps he is, maybe, indeed, and I don't do him any injustice either. But there's certainly moments when you hear such beautiful music being sung and used in the liturgy, I would argue. Again, where it's done out of a sense of devotion and in prayer, and in celebration without any attention being actually drawn to the person who's singing or the musicians, and where it's just, you can sense it's for the glory of God and out of a sense of devotion and prayer. They're the moments, I think, to relish and to treasure. So you hear it sung by Andrea Bocelli, and he's a man of tremendous faith. I think maybe it's just a subjective thing. It comes through there, certainly for me. Who's the other Franciscan friar that we play here as well? You can tell in his singing too, it's motivated by faith. Anyway, interesting thought. I'll leave that one with you. Again, it can be subjective too. Pope Francis, again, it's not just matters liturgical. He speaks out about, or reminds us of, he uses lots of, being the Jesuit that he is, common or garden things too to help instruct us. And just Tara can just put a Vatican News item in front of me here. The Tokyo Olympics, they've been dubbed the sad Olympics now because in order to avoid the spread of COVID-19, the Japanese authorities have decided there'll be no spectators in the stands of the stadiums, no hugs between athletes allowed. Olympians will have to put their medals around their own necks to avoid any possible contact. Now, you'd have to question. That seems like, I don't know, it just doesn't sit right, does it, really? A year after the postponement of the Games due to the pandemic, Japan is preparing to experience the world's prime sporting event with conflicting feelings, joy and sadness, and certainly concern, I suppose, for the health of others too. But these Olympics mark a first in relation to the strict measures that are going on, and perhaps the meaning and the value of the event with its 5 symbolically intertwined rings and its spirit of fraternity among peoples will be allowed to more fully emerge. So some good indeed can come of these things too. And it's a message certainly that's needed today, the Pope would argue, or would point out for us. And he's spoken on this idea before, in fact, because we all find ourselves in the same position, really. So he's underlined, the Pope, in the past, the educational potential of sport for young people and the importance of putting oneself on the line. St. Paul speaks of this too, doesn't he? Running for a prize, that a wreath that will wither, but running the race to the finish. He uses those to the Greek people he's writing to, the Corinthians and so on. So if anything, such a moment hopefully can be a moment that we can recognize our unity, also the human endeavor that goes with becoming an Olympian, and the merit of virtue and fair play in all of these aspects of sport. So in an interview with Gazzetta dello Sport, a newspaper in Italy, the Pope says, victory gives you a thrill that is difficult to describe, but there's also something marvelous about a defeat. That's a very Jesuit thing to say, isn't it? What are the two extremes? Consolation and desolation. You've heard Father John speak much about that in his Ignatian adventure. Wonderful victories can be born from certain defeats because you unleash the desire for redemption after identifying the mistake. So is that not the spiritual journey right there for us? I would even add that winners don't know what they're missing out on. So we've all got to be losers in the best possible sense. So if you're a loser, take heart. Take heart. We learn from our losses, and they can be, rather than stepping stones, or rather the other stumbling blocks, they can become stepping stones or defeats. In a time marked by fracture and polarization of all kinds, the Pope says that sport can therefore be a reminder, like the Special Olympics athletes do, a universal language that can overcome cultural, social, religious and physical differences, and it can unite people, rendering them participants in the same game, together protagonists of victories and defeat. It's a thought worth dwelling on, in fairness. Of course, the recent European Football Channel, if you're into that kind of thing, I must say I didn't watch a kick of the whole thing from start to finish. I saw one or two brief highlights afterwards. The Copa America, is that? I wasn't even aware of such a thing, whatever that is. Athletes on the tracks in the field will not be sparing any energy in order to win. These are recent competitions. The spirit of competition is strengthened by the long wait, of course, since the last Olympics. Athletes go into training, in anticipation 4 years ahead of time. So they've had a 5th year now. And sometimes a year can make a big difference for an athlete in terms of reaching their peak or their prime. So Pope Francis has repeatedly expressed his appreciation for the amateur and community dimension of sport and for its social function. And he also well knows that sports, especially at a professional level, is fueled by competition and the desire to overcome one's personal limits. And if that's the case, then you see the connection is obvious there, the analogy works well. At the level of sport and a secular prize, like St. Paul says, how much more then for the spiritual prize that will not wither and will not fade, and where there is no defeat. The defeat, in fact, or weakness or frailty or failure is part of the journey of the cross in order to arrive at the resurrection. So, Pope speaks of winning together the medal of human fraternity. You should take that another step, really. Not just human fraternity, but spiritual fraternity. And indeed the salvation of one's soul and everyone's soul into that too. So it's, again, a very useful analogy because it just fills our news nowadays. Sport, I suppose it distracts us a little bit from all the other grief, and God knows there's plenty of grief in the world, lots to bring to prayer these days. Now, just looking at our missionary document, Ad Gentes, maybe we'll chat a little bit more about that as well. So now, brothers and religious sisters should be on fire with this zeal, and likewise lay people with regard to their fellow countrymen and women, especially those who are poorer. And we feature that in our prayers here on Radio Maria, if you've noticed too. We feel ourselves called to serve our own fellow countrymen and women, and well, the English-speaking world, of course, but obviously leaning towards all our Irish brothers and sisters, and that with a certain zeal and a fire, a heat of willing and wishing the conversion of all, especially those whom we know and love, who have drifted away from faith. That's our task. Episcopal conferences, that's the bishops of course, should ensure that periodically there are refresher courses on the Bible and in spiritual and pastoral theology, so that amid all the change and flux, a clergy will acquire a deeper knowledge of theology and of pastoral methods. Well, we're engaging in that in I won't say so much an academic way here on Radio Maria, but certainly in a conversational way. We're certainly stimulating, and we've had some lovely messages from listeners, how much they've learnt over, listening to Radio Maria over a period of time. And that's the Holy Spirit, there's no doubt about that. For the rest, everything that the Council has enacted, especially in the decree on the life and ministry of priests, should be religiously observed. So again, if there are those who want to depart from the teachings of the Church as handed on by Vatican documents, it can lead away. It can lead to a separation. And really that's what's at stake, I think, in the Pope's recent motu proprio, trying to avoid that, certainly. Not that we turn away from all our traditions, absolutely not. But how we value these and treasure them and make use of them is very important. Qualified ministers are needed to carry out the missionary program of a particular church. They must be prepared in good time and in a manner that is keeping with the needs of each church. So there's no reason why parishes shouldn't have catechists working there, if not voluntary, well, maybe employed in some way, part-time, and well-trained and helping to pass on the faith. Such persons are more and more coming together in associations. It would be a good thing for episcopal conferences to draw up a common plan for dialogue with these groups. If it happens that in certain regions there is a group of those which is impeded from accepting the Catholic faith because they cannot adapt themselves to the particular guise in which the Church presents itself in that place, then it is desirable that this situation should be specially provided for until all Christians can gather together in one community. That's very interesting. It's a nice general way, really, of saying what we've been particularly focusing on in relation to the traditional form of the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. Adaptations, or what's it saying here? The situation should be specially provided for. Didn't say adaptations now. Excuse me. They're talking here in the footnote about institutions of personal prelatures foreseen to facilitate special pastoral projects, social categories insofar as is demanded for the better exercise of the apostolate. So again, it's in the decree and life and ministry of priests. So these initiatives, again, to be safeguarded and watched over and encouraged. If the Holy See is able to provide missionaries, then bishops should invite them to their diocese. They should welcome them and actively assist them in their undertakings. That's various new groups that might be taking root. So very good. That's only a small little excerpt there from Ad Gentes. We'll come back to that again. We'll continue that conversation too, praise God, and continue to grow in our faith. So I hope some of that has been helpful for you today. Do please get in touch with us with your own questions or areas that might be useful to discuss further. The time now is approaching 12 o'clock. We'll pause now for our Angelus and midday prayer.